I always found train journeys to have a certain nostalgic charm. That night, I boarded the night train bound for a small town in the countryside, where I would attend a family event. The dim lights and the rhythmic sound of the wheels on the tracks were comforting, making me feel like I was being lulled into a tranquil dream. The carriage was almost empty, with only a few passengers scattered across the seats. I sat by the window, watching the nocturnal landscape pass by as a blur of shadows and sparse lights. The dark fields and forests offered only glimpses of their forms in the moonlight. Shortly after midnight, the train entered a tunnel. Something felt different, as if the air around us had changed, becoming denser and more oppressive. The tunnel seemed endless, and a sense of unease began to grow within me, as if we were being dragged into another world. When we finally emerged from the tunnel, the landscape outside had changed drastically. I didn't recognize anything anymore. The vegetation was strange, with twisted trees and a dense fog that seemed to pulse with a life of its own, enveloping everything around us in a nightmare atmosphere. A sudden chill ran down my spine. I looked around the carriage, noticing that the few passengers present were also uneasy. No one seemed to know what was happening, and whispers of confusion and fear began to fill the air. An elderly man sitting a few rows from me stood up and walked down the aisle. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with fear. He constantly looked outside, as if expecting to see something horrible at any moment, murmuring inaudible words. "This isn't right," he muttered to no one in particular. "This isn't our world." His words echoed in the carriage, intensifying the sense of dread that we all felt. My hands began to tremble. I grabbed my phone to check for any signal, but the screen showed only static. I tried to convince myself it was just a temporary technical glitch, but the growing fear in my chest told me something was terribly wrong. The train kept moving, and the feeling of strangeness only increased. The lights in the carriage began to flicker, and a low, almost inaudible sound seemed to echo around us. It sounded like murmurs, as if voices were whispering dark secrets in the shadows. Suddenly the train came to a sudden halt. We were all thrown forward, and I heard cries of surprise and pain. I looked out the window and saw that we were stopped in front of a decaying and abandoned station, covered in moss and showing signs of long-term neglect. The station was shrouded in thick shadows, and indistinct figures seemed to move within them. A sense of dread took hold of me. No one wanted to get off the train, but the conductor announced that we had to disembark. His voice, usually calm, was now laden with tension. Reluctantly, I got off the carriage along with the other passengers. The air was cold and damp, and the silence was oppressive. The station was deserted, but there was a palpable sense that we were not alone. The shadows seemed to have a life of their own, moving and writhing around us. "We need to find help," said a woman who was holding her child's hand tightly. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her words trembled. "Someone must know what's happening." As we explored the station, I noticed that the faces of the other passengers reflected the same terror I felt. The shadows seemed to move, dancing at the edges of our vision, but when we looked directly at them, there was nothing. The environment was suffocating, charged with a sense of ominous anticipation. In a dark corner of the station, we found a partially open door. Inside, there was a small room with walls covered in strange and indecipherable symbols, carved with an eerie precision that seemed to vibrate with an energy of its own. "What is this?" I asked, more to myself than to the others. The feeling that something terrible was about to happen was overwhelming. The symbols seemed to pulse, emitting a faint and unsettling glow. Suddenly, a piercing scream echoed through the station. We ran back to the platform and saw a woman kneeling, crying and pointing at the lifeless body of a man on the ground. He was pale as wax, his eyes wide open in an expression of pure terror, as if he had seen something unimaginable. "What happened?" I asked, trying to remain calm despite the growing panic. "Is he dead?" "Something attacked him," she stammered, her words broken by fear. "Something in the shadows." Her eyes were fixed on a point in the darkness, as if she expected the threat to reappear at any moment. I looked around, trying to see what could have caused this, but there was nothing. Only the darkness and the feeling that we were being watched by invisible eyes lurking in every shadowy corner. "We need to get back on the train," said one of the passengers, his voice filled with urgency. "It's safer inside." He looked around frantically, as if expecting an attack at any moment. We agreed and started to return, but the shadows seemed to close in more and more, as if they had a life of their own. The sense of imminent danger was suffocating, and each step seemed followed by inaudible whispers. Back on the train, we closed all the doors and windows, trying to protect ourselves from whatever was out there. The woman with the child began to pray softly, her words a fragile comfort against the growing terror that enveloped us. The train started moving again, but now the atmosphere was charged with fear. Each of us was on edge, waiting for the next attack. The rhythmic sound of the wheels on the tracks seemed like a harbinger of something terrible. The lights began to flicker again, and the sound of whispers grew louder. I looked outside and saw spectral figures running alongside the train, their faces twisted into masks of agony, stretched into expressions of eternal despair and pain. A passenger tried to open a window to scream for help, but as soon as he did, one of these spectral figures entered, attacking him with ferocity. The carriage was thrown into chaos, screams and panic echoing as we tried to fend off the entity. "Close the windows," someone shouted, their voice filled with despair. We rushed to close them, but the man was already beyond help, his body contorted in an unnatural position, his eyes glazed with terror. Sitting in my seat, trembling, I tried to think of a way out of this situation. Nothing I had ever heard or read could have prepared me for this. Reality seemed to disintegrate around me, giving way to an endless nightmare. The spectral figures continued to haunt us, appearing and disappearing like smoke. One of them stopped in front of me, its empty eyes fixed on me. I could feel its hatred and despair like a palpable wave, threatening to consume me. "Please, go away," I whispered, my voice barely audible. It dissipated, but the feeling of its presence remained, like an invisible weight on my shoulders. A passenger, a young man, began murmuring something about the threshold. He said he had read about it in an old book, a place between life and death, where lost souls wandered, trapped forever between worlds. "We're stuck in the threshold," he said, his voice trembling. "We need to find a way back to our world before it's too late." His eyes were filled with fear and hopelessness. "How do we do that?" I asked, desperate. "We don't know where we are or how we got here." The idea of being trapped in an alternate dimension was overwhelming. "The tunnel," he replied, with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "That tunnel must be the key. We need to go back to it." His determination was our only hope. The idea of going back to the tunnel was terrifying, but it seemed to be our only chance. We agreed to try, though our hearts were filled with fear. The train, as if understanding our intention, began to change direction. The way back seemed darker and more sinister, and the whispers grew louder, as if the shadows themselves were conspiring against us. The spectral figures continued to appear, now more aggressive, as if they knew we were trying to escape. A passenger was pulled out of the carriage, his screams echoing into the night as he disappeared into the shadows. "We're not going to make it," someone murmured, the hope draining from their voice. Panic was beginning to take hold of all of us. "We need to stay calm," said the woman with the child, trying to be strong. "We will get out of here." Her words were a fragile thread of hope amidst the despair. The tunnel finally appeared ahead, a black maw waiting to swallow us. The darkness inside it seemed deeper, more threatening, as if it hid all the horrors we had faced. The train entered the tunnel, and the lights went out completely. We were immersed in total darkness, only the sound of the train keeping us connected to reality, the noise of metal against tracks our only guide. "Stay together," said the young man who mentioned the threshold. "We're almost there." His voice was a beacon of hope in the darkness. Time seemed to drag on as we moved forward. We could hear things moving around us, feeling their presence without seeing anything. The tension was unbearable, and each second felt like an eternity. Suddenly a faint light appeared ahead, slowly growing. It was the tunnel's exit. Hope rekindled within us, like a fragile flame amidst the darkness. But then, the spectral figures attacked with renewed ferocity. The carriage was thrown into chaos again, screams and struggles as we tried to defend ourselves. It was a desperate battle for survival. I held tightly to my seat, praying we would reach the exit in time. The feeling of being on the brink of madness was overwhelming, but I tried to focus on the light ahead. The train finally burst out of the tunnel, emerging into the night. The spectral figures disappeared, dissolving into nothingness, leaving us in a silence that was almost deafening. The familiar landscape returned, and the sense of relief was overwhelming. We had made it. We were back in our world. We looked at each other, sharing a moment of silent gratitude. The nightmare was over, but the scars would remain forever. As the train continued its journey, we remained silent, each lost in their thoughts. The night seemed less frightening now, and the rhythmic sound of the wheels was a comforting reminder of reality. We had faced the unimaginable and survived, but deep down, I knew that the shadows would never completely leave us. The memory of that night would haunt us forever, a dark reminder of the boundary between our world and the unknown. It was a dark and stormy night when I was left alone at home for the first time. My parents had gone to town to take care of some urgent matters, leaving me in the care of our neighbor, Mrs. Maria. However, Mrs. Maria was called away at the last minute to care for her sick grandson, and I was confident I could look after myself until my parents returned. I sat on the couch, eating popcorn and watching my favorite TV show. The rain pounded against the windows, and the thunder echoed through the house. I liked these stormy nights. I found them exciting. But that night, a feeling of unease began to settle in my heart. The clock on the wall showed 10 p.m. when the lights started to flicker. Suddenly, the house was plunged into darkness. I got up slowly, feeling my heart race. I grabbed a flashlight my parents always kept in the kitchen for emergencies. As I made my way through the house, listening to the sound of the storm outside, I noticed a strange light coming from the forest behind the house. It was a faint, flickering light, like the flame of a candle. Curiosity was stronger than fear. I put on a coat and my rubber boots and went out the back door, driven by the need to discover the source of that mysterious light. With the flashlight in one hand and courage in the other, I walked along the path leading to the forest. The storm seemed to calm as I ventured deeper among the trees, but the sound of the rain was still present, creating a haunting symphony. The light I had seen from the house was closer now, and I could make out a figure next to it. The figure appeared to be performing some sort of ritual, moving slowly around the light. Hidden behind a tree trunk, I watched intently. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I could see the person better. It was an elderly woman with long, disheveled hair, dressed in dirty rags. She was muttering words I couldn't understand, but they sent shivers down my spine. I instantly knew I was in the presence of a witch, like those in the stories my grandmother used to tell. The witch raised something high, something that reflected the candlelight. It was a small doll made of straw, tied with black ribbons. I felt a chill run through my body as I watched. Suddenly the witch stopped her ritual and turned directly toward where I was hiding. Her piercing eyes seemed to see through the trees in the darkness. Panic surged within me. Before I could react, the witch pointed a bony finger at me and muttered something that made the forest seem to tremble. I backed away, tripping over roots and branches, trying to escape that malevolent gaze. I ran back to the house as fast as my legs would carry me, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. Behind me, I could hear the witch's laughter echoing through the night. When I finally reached the safety of the house, I locked all the doors and windows. The flashlight was nearly out of battery, but I managed to find some candles and lit them, filling the room with a flickering light. Sitting on the couch, I tried to calm my breathing and process what had just happened. Had I really seen a witch? Or had my imagination played a trick on me? As these questions swirled in my mind, I heard a scratching sound at the window. With my heart in my throat, I got up slowly and approached the window to look. Outside, in the darkness of the night, I saw the witch's eyes glowing intensely. She was closer than I had imagined, with her hands pressed against the glass, watching me with a sinister smile. I backed away, almost knocking over one of the candles. I ran to the phone and tried to call my parents, but the line was dead. There was no cell signal due to the storm. Desperate, I remembered the stories my grandmother used to tell about how to ward off witches. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a handful of salt, spreading it around all the doors and windows. I returned to the living room and waited. The witch continued to watch me through the window, but now she seemed more frustrated. She muttered something and scratched the glass with more intensity, but she couldn't get in. I started to feel a bit safer, but I knew I couldn't let my guard down. I remembered an old spell book my grandmother kept in the attic and decided to fetch it. With the flashlight nearly dead, I climbed the creaky stairs to the attic. The place was full of dust and cobwebs, but I found the book exactly where my grandmother had left it. The book was heavy and old, with yellowed pages and a worn leather cover. I returned to the living room and began to flip through the pages, looking for anything that could help me get rid of the witch. I found a protection spell that seemed simple enough to try. With my heart pounding, I began to recite the words aloud, concentrating on each syllable. The witch outside stopped scratching the window and watched in silence. When I finished the spell, I felt a wave of warmth wash over me. The witch slowly backed away, as if repelled by an invisible force. She disappeared into the darkness of the night, and I felt a sense of relief. But I knew this wasn't the end. The witch could return at any moment, and I needed to be prepared. I kept the spellbook by my side and stayed vigilant for the rest of the night, trying not to fall asleep. The storm outside seemed to calm, but the fear inside me was still strong. When the first rays of sunlight began to illuminate the horizon, I finally relaxed. My parents arrived soon after, finding me exhausted but safe. I told them everything that had happened, but they thought it was just the vivid imagination of a scared boy. However, my grandmother believed me and promised to teach me more about protection against evil. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the image of the witch from my mind. I avoided the forest and always kept a candle lit at night as a precaution. My grandmother began to teach me about herbs, amulets, and protection spells. I absorbed every lesson with attention, determined never to be caught off guard again. One night, while studying with my grandmother, she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. I kept the spellbook by. She said the witch I had seen was known as Morgana, an ancient entity that had haunted those lands for centuries. Morgana was known for stealing children and performing dark rituals. My grandmother said she had faced Morgana when she was young, and that the witch had an insatiable desire for revenge. I felt a new wave of fear, but also a renewed determination. I knew I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. Together with my grandmother, I began creating protective amulets to distribute to the villagers. The stories about the witch began to spread through the village, and soon everyone was on alert. People started taking extra precautions, and the atmosphere grew tense. One night, while at my grandmother's house, we heard a distant scream coming from the forest. I looked at my grandmother, who nodded silently. It was time to face Morgana again. Together we grabbed our amulets and spells and headed for the forest. The full moon lit our path, and the night was eerily silent. When we reached the clearing where I had first seen Morgana, we saw the witch performing another ritual. This time she was surrounded by strange symbols drawn on the ground. We stood at the edge of the clearing, watching intently. The witch seemed more powerful than before, and we knew it would be a difficult fight. With courage, I began to recite the protection spell I'd learned. My grandmother joined me, our voices echoing in the dark forest. The witch Morgana stopped abruptly, her eyes fixed on me, recognizing the growing power emanating from us. She let out a piercing scream, and the trees around seemed to shudder, but we continued reciting the spell, our voices firm and resolute. Morgana began to move her hands in circles, conjuring an invisible force that pushed us back. I felt the pressure but held firmly onto my grandmother's hand, gaining strength through the connection. "Don't stop," my grandmother shouted over the roar of the wind. "We can win this together." I focused more deeply, visualizing a protective barrier around us. The moonlight began to shine more intensely, as if responding to our invocation. Morgana struggled against this growing force, her spells becoming increasingly desperate. Suddenly, a burst of light emanated from the circle where we stood. Morgana was thrown back, her shadowy form flickering like a flame about to be extinguished. I felt immediate relief, but knew it wasn't over yet. We advanced toward the witch, our steps determined. "We must finish this," my grandmother said. With a swift motion, my grandmother threw a handful of herbs over Morgana, reciting an ancient banishment spell. The witch howled, her figure beginning to disintegrate in the bright light. Morgana cast one last hateful look at me before disappearing completely. The clearing fell silent, and the wind abruptly ceased. The moon shone down on us, witnessing our victory. We fell to our knees, exhausted but victorious. We knew we had achieved something extraordinary, something that would protect the village for a long time. Returning home, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The witch was finally defeated, and I could go back to living my life without the constant fear of being attacked. In the days that followed, news of our victory spread through the village. The villagers came to thank us and seek advice on how to protect themselves. I became somewhat of a local hero, but never let it go to my head. I continued to learn from my grandmother, determined to protect our home from any future threats. Years passed, and the story of the witch Morgana became a legend told around the village fires. But I knew it wasn't just a story, it was a reminder of the courage and power we all have within us. As for me, I continued to live with the memory of that night and the lessons learned. I never forgot the sight of the witch in the forest, but I also never forgot the strength we found to face her. And so, I grew up with a sense of determination and a deep understanding of the unknown forces around us. I knew I was ready for whatever came next, and that gave me peace. The witch Morgana may have been defeated, but I knew there were always new challenges and mysteries to face. And I was ready for all of them, with the knowledge and courage gained from that fateful night.